When you want to know the truth, turn to Stand for Truth Radio. We'll bring you news and politics of such great shows as Stand for Truth, Knowles on the News, and Talk It Out with my co-host Mike Closer. Stand for Truth Radio with Susan Knowles is available on iHeartRadio, Spreaker, SoundCloud, iTunes, and more. You won't miss a beat if you join us today. And also, don't forget to sign up for my latest breaking news articles at susanknowles.com. Stand for Truth Radio with Susan Knowles. It's all the news and politics in one convenient location.
And now, it's time to Stand for Truth with the host of Stand for Truth Radio, Susan Knowles.
And welcome to the program, everyone. I'm your host, Susan Knowles. Please check out my website at susanknowles.com and find out about all the ways you can follow Stand for Truth Radio and other shows I do, such as Knowles on the News and Talk It Out. And finally, follow me on Twitter at Susan Knowles. Now, as you know, Stand for Truth Radio with Susan Knowles is now heard on iHeartRadio. It's very exciting because it opens up our podcast to millions of listeners. So go there and just look up on the podcast, Stand for Truth Radio with Susan Knowles. You'll find us there. Follow us there and share with your friends. Now, my guest today is SCOTT GREER. He's author of the new book, No Campus for White Men, The Transformation of Higher Education into Hateful Indoctrination. No Campus for White Men sheds a light on how the obsession with diversity, victimization, and identity politics creates a hateful atmosphere on campus and could ultimately lead to further balkanization in American society. His book outlines the ideological components of campus insanity, what elements of higher education are targeted by protesters, and what steps can be taken to turn back the tide of this liberal mania. SCOTT GREER is an editor and columnist at the Daily Caller. His work has appeared on the Drudge Report, RealClearPolitics, Fox Nation, Breitbart, and numerous other outlets. GREER has covered education topics for 4 years and got his start in journalism at Campus Reform, a conservative-leaning news site aiming to expose abuse and bias on college campuses. Besides education, he's also covered the 2016 presidential race, immigration, and foreign policy. He has appeared on CNN, NPR, BBC Radio, Fox Business, One America News Network, and numerous other media outlets. So let's welcome to the show, SCOTT GREER. Hi, Scott. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm glad that you could be with us today. I want to first let you know I read your book from beginning to end, No Campus for White Men. Great book. Glad you wrote it. And we're going to talk all about that book today.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Now, let's just start here. You say in your book that what we see on college campuses isn't necessarily just overly coddling of students, but you describe it as something else, and you call it identity politics. Can you talk about that, what that is?
Well, what it's now being come across as, it's not necessarily just every student who just feels like I can't handle ideas. It's not just every student doing that, because that could apply to numerous other students on campus, no matter who they are, what their background is, and what arguments they're using. But there's a specific kind of argument that's used to silence free speech on campus. And by referencing identity politics, what it's about is that certain protected classes of people are able to silence speech because they can claim that their status as a protected class, whether it's a sexual, racial, or some other type of minority group, they can claim that they need to suppress because it threatens their lives that certain ideas are expressed on campus. And colleges themselves give special benefits to these students based on their status as a member of a protected class. I mean, this happens at the admissions process when affirmative action specifically gives preference to racial minorities and other minority groups at the admissions process. And when they get into college, they also have studies programs that are specifically designed for them. So when they get into these kind of arguments over political discourse and suppressing free speech, you have to come from that protected class where a college has already got special benefits for you and does more to pay attention to your needs in order to suppress free speech. And this isn't necessarily helicopter parenting. If you're, say, a white male who's like, I don't want to read the Iliad because it's too violent or something, you're going to be laughed at unless you're using kind of the terminology and the rhetoric that is associated with identity politics. You can get the Iliad suppressed if you're saying, well, there's not enough minorities in this work, and thus that is an insult to me and threatens me. Thus, you can say get that removed from the curriculum. So it has to be in the specific sphere of identity politics and reference to victimhood culture in order to get speech suppressed and the curriculum changed in order to meet the students' needs or desires and that.
So let's ask this question. Where did they learn this? Where did they learn, they being the people on college campuses, the students, where did they learn that they could do this type of thing and get speech silenced?
Well, as I said previously, and I know No Campus for White Men, it starts at the admissions process where they get this thing. They get into college in a lot of cases based on them highlighting how they're a victim, how they are a part of an oppressed minority in this country, and life is terrible for them, and thus they need special privileges just due to that status. So at the start of a student's college career, the college automatically says, look, if you are a part of this protected class, we'll let you into our college and we'll give you possibly even a scholarship. So it kind of starts even there, but it also goes into the rest of society where we have other things in the politics and other spheres of life where people are given privileges based on them referencing a protected class, where we do have people who say that, like, look, I need these special privileges because of who I am, and I'm a part of this special group. And I think more and more as America is divided and fights over what necessarily makes an American identity, more people remove themselves from kind of the standard national fabric and move into these narrow tribes that go along with their set interest group and with their set identity that they ascribe to themselves. So it's almost, for students, it starts at the admissions process, which is heavily dominated by affirmative action. And in general, our culture is moving more and more to this area of where we reward people for kind of creating a special identity for themselves that removes themselves from the dominant majority.
Yeah, and I can see, for me, it's kind of like over the past 8 years, it seems like that has become more and more prevalent, that we have this type of thing. And I honestly, I know that our public school system and colleges are very progressive and liberal left progressive, but I haven't seen so much of this until the past 8 years. So I think our political climate under Obama caused a lot of this. I mean, don't you think that it's increased over the past 8 years?
Oh, absolutely. And that's what I note in my book. And I think Obama has contributed to it in numerous ways. I think as a president, when there were sensitive racial conflicts that arose in our country, he always tried to wade into it, which didn't really help the situation. It kind of worsened it. And it kind of came out on the side of the left or whoever was agitating in the cause. I mean, we saw this when there was the case in Harvard, where a Harvard University professor was arrested over a miscommunication. He waded it in and said the police were acting stupidly. We saw this in Trayvon Martin when he waded into that and said, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon, which also put and said, George Zimmerman is guilty of murder, which court of law did not find he was guilty of murder. And he always kind of waded into these sensitive subjects in a way that came out as favoring one side or over another. And that kind of emboldened people to see that they should kind of play these kind of politics, not just in the regular sphere, but on colleges especially. And when it comes to colleges itself, Obama's administration set new guidelines in terms of when it comes to sexual assault. That was based on a lot of this kind of fear mongering that was going on. I mean, we all kind of heard of the statistic that 1 in 5 college women are at risk of being sexually assaulted, which the studies that are showing that are kind of faulty, and the actual data shows that it's less than 1%. But no matter what, that regardless, the Obama administration believed that standard and then set new rules for all colleges under Title IX laws that they must now abide by a standard of convicting these quote-unquote sexual assaulters under a lower standard of proving a standard of guilt. And thus we've had more and more cases of people who've been falsely accused of sexual assault being expelled from school. And when it's taken to a court of law, the court of law says, no, this wasn't sexual assault, and even sometimes punishes the accuser. But under the standard that was set by the Obama administration, these kids are permanently expelled from school and then have to spend years and years in civil litigation to get back into school. So I think in a lot of ways, when Obama was president, he made a lot of these things worse on college campuses.
Yeah, because it's kind of like the Saul Alinsky rules. You don't really have to tell the truth. You just have to say it enough times where people believe it. So these statistics seem like they were very much, in a lot of cases, like you were talking about, how many sexual assaults there are on campus. There doesn't have to be truth in it. It's kind of like, what do we need to do in order to further our agenda? And that's what we're going to do. And I think that's what we're seeing on a lot of college campuses these days. I wanted to ask you, too, you talk about the admissions process and everything. Is there really anything, any truth to white institutional racism where we still need affirmative action on the college campuses?
Exactly. No. Even all the arguments admit that there's no longer institutional racism, that they've overcome Jim Crow and the past discrimination. That's not even the chief argument anymore by people who are arguing for affirmative action. The primary argument for affirmative action now is that we need diversity on campuses. We need kind of a racial diversity that almost disturbingly comes close to racial quotas, because students need that to even learn more creatively and be stronger students. Even though when the studies really don't show that. There's no real studies that are showing that. But when it comes to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor in a case in the 2000s argued on affirmative action, argued that the reason why you need it is for diversity. She didn't really come up of course we want students to interact with people from numerous backgrounds, no matter the socioeconomic status, what part of the country they come from. We want students, as a part of their way of maturing into adults, to interact with people from different backgrounds. But with affirmative action is kind of setting up, artificial racial quotas, and then just going to say, well, if you have a bunch of races combined, no matter what their quality, the quality of their students or their merits in getting into the college, we need that just because they're going to be instantly smarter. So they don't even pretend with that. I mean, now these college kids are going and saying that there's some type of systemic racism that, even though these institutions don't intentionally discriminate against students of color, they still do somehow and oppress them just because it's built into their DNA to be racist and to support white supremacy and all that, which is kind of nonsense. But when you look at the primary arguments for affirmative action, it's all about increasing diversity and then claiming that diversity is a strength, when most of the studies are really kind of skeptical of that. And it kind of goes against the standard American idea that we should be judged on the content of our character and not on the color of our skin.
Yeah, it's kind of a contradiction to those schools that are, let's say, all African-American school. Other people aren't admitted into the school unless they're African-American. Like, I think isn't Brown University like that? And I'm not really sure if that's correct. But
not Brown University, but there's historically black colleges like Howard, a couple others that are kind of set that standard. So
that kind of it's a contradiction to the diversity argument. And then also on campuses today, we have people who are saying we want diversity. However, we need a safe zone. We need to have our segregated place over here where we live. I mean, doesn't that go against the argument for diversity?
Yeah, because I think the examples that are starting to be set is that a couple of West Coast universities, such as California State University, Los Angeles, African-American students demanded that they had segregated housing that was both cheaper than normal housing and in some ways a lot nicer than the rest of the student housing. But they needed this special housing because apparently the microaggressions they were hearing on a daily basis was just too much for them to handle. And thus they kind of use this issue to pressure administrators to give them this privilege that resembles Jim Crow. And then even administrators, when they came back to defend it, they're like, oh, well, other schools are doing the same thing where they have housing specifically intended for certain ethnicities. But that's not really an argument. It's just showing that more and more campuses are doing these type of things where they're segregating students in their campus living arrangements. And in some ways, a lot of the best arrangements are going to more minority classes just because they claim that they have a lot of microaggressions that they can't handle, which I don't know how they're going to handle when they're out in the real world and they can't cry to an administrator that they need, a safe space in their work office or whatever. But they use a lot of these arguments. I mean, it's not about inclusion and necessarily diversity. It is a lot of ways now turning into segregation and to promoting your own group over the interests of any others. And what's now happening is that all these kind of like special minority identities, the only thing they can organize around and unite around is that white men are a problem and they hold all the power and they must go to war against and, seen as the enemy. And that's kind of a disturbing development that's only happened recently in the United States. We've always had this, fringe groups have espoused these ideas, but I think now where it's become the mainstream of campus is a recent development.
Yeah, and I also think when you said about what are they going to do in the real world, well, isn't the left really trying to change, quote unquote, the real world to fit their agenda as well? So we don't have in the real world maybe it's going to be the same way. If they get their way, it's going to be like that. I mean, we've seen all the protests recently with President Trump. I mean, that's just a clue or a little hint of what's coming in our society if the left continues to have their way. So I see it changing. Them trying to change the outside so that they can better fit into their own ideal of what a world should be like, which is a continuation of what they had in college, really.
Yeah, absolutely. They do want to apply these things that they learn in college and create in college and apply it to the rest of the world. They want these standards set, not just on a college campus, but in the workplace. They want these standards set in government. They always complain that there's not enough racial representation in this workplace. There's not enough minorities on corporate boards. There's not enough, diversity in who shops at this particular place. Right. So they kind of always make these. I mean, there's all. I think to cite a recent example is that they complain about how CrossFit doesn't have enough diversity. Which, it's not any attention of CrossFit, everyone is welcome, they don't discriminate, but the fact that it's like too white is a problem. And so it's not just at college campuses where we see this thing, where they see something that is benign and, it ends up being, too white for their comfort and they want radical change to it. Yeah. And it's almost a way that they want to mandate racial quotas for everything in American life, no matter what it is. What music you listen to, it has to be, it has to have enough minorities listening to it. If where you go to work out, it has to have a set number of racial diversity. And so it kind of this way that we become obsessed with achieving this, they can never really be satisfied utopia of diversity, but we continually strive for it. And these activists use this tool to continually demand more and more. And once you give in, that doesn't really settle it for them because they just keep making more and more extreme demands. And we see this on college campuses all the time. And I document it in No Campus for White Men, where they do, if you give them one reward, they then start demanding more extreme demands.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like giving in to a child who's screaming for candy. The more they scream, the more you give them, the more they want. I mean, it's kind of common sense. And I know we've kind of lost a little bit of reasonableness these days in our society, but I mean, that's what it is. And now, in your book, No Campus for White Men, you also talk about how white people are viewed on campus. In general, how are they viewed?
Well, in the moral culture that's being created on college campuses, it's called victimhood culture. Whites are put at the bottom of that moral hierarchy because they have privilege and have historically served as oppressors. Now, it doesn't matter your background or beliefs when it comes to you as a white person and how you're viewed on campus. You can be, your parents could have, or your great-grandparents could have come over in 1910 from Latvia, but you're still responsible for slavery. Even though you're a diehard leftist yourself, you have to a lot to atone for simply because of the color of your skin. And when in the victimhood culture, moral status is assigned to you based on your ability to prove that you're an oppressed victim. So and it has to come from kind of a historical and theoretical perspective. The fact that you are a poor, coal miner's son doesn't matter, if you're white. And at the same time, if you're the daughter of a wealthy, multimillionaire who happens to be African American, you can still be an oppressed victim just because of the kind of culture that this is assigned to. It's all about your ability to demonstrate that you belong to a minority identity group rather than your socioeconomic status or your background or your beliefs. It all comes down to, in many cases, the color of your skin and how you're viewed. And we can see this more and more when it comes to Caucasians on campus. You can scan any day on Twitter, and you can see young people of color just like screaming expletive white people over any event. When the Patriots won the Super Bowl, there was an outcry that white people have won again somehow, even though there's several minorities on the New England Patriots. So I don't know how you square that away, but no matter. For a lot of these activists, it doesn't have to make sense for them to cry about it. And you see this growing more and more, and especially when it comes to these activism, when they call them white allies try to join, they kind of put them over to the side, and they always tell them, move to the back of the line because, this is they exclude them from certain meetings because it's this is a safe space for people of color, and, no whites are allowed in. And it's kind of a curriculum that they've learned. When they learn history, they see the world through a prism that white people have only done evil and atrocities wherever they've come. They're, in the words of Susan Sontag, great cancer of the human race. And so this is kind of the idea that's been percolating, that is being inculcated in these students' minds, and they express it through their activism on campus.
Yeah, it's really very close to the civil rights era. This is what's happening. It's kind of the reverse, though, where, in the civil rights era, whites were more supposedly racist against blacks, and now it's blacks are kind of and it is racism. I don't care whether you want to call it racism or not. When you're telling whites to get in the back of the line or keep your mouth closed because this is our fight, or going into college campus and sort of attacking whites because they're white, it's racism, and I don't care who's doing it. And that's another thing I think in our society we have to take a look at and make a change to, where that you can be a racist no matter what color you are, color of your skin. So it's kind of a ridiculous thing, but I can see that that's going on in campuses, and it's in a reverse. Now you talk about free speech zones on campus. Can you talk about that? What those are? Free speech zones are these, they're kind of one of the ways that they use to suppress free speech. What they do is these colleges, it's a way of working around them having to allow speech that they don't like, particularly conservative speech. So what they do is they create a kind of all out of the way place on campus, usually some grassy knoll or something that no students attend, and is look, this is the only place you can express free speech. And this is a way of silencing conservatives or views that they don't like on campus, but then saying we allow free speech. We have this free speech zone over here, even though it's out of the way and nobody's seeing what's happening. So a lot of the times if, pro-lifers want to gather together and have, kind of a demonstration, they're forced over into this out of the way place that nobody's going to see them. And they have no effect, and they're not really expressing their free speech because they're limited to this one little area that nobody's going to go by. And it really does silence their speech. It's a way for colleges to get around the First Amendment while still restricting it. But then they can claim, oh, no, we respect it. Most civil liberties groups always complain about this. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, which is a great group, FIRE for short, always goes after schools who try to implement these free speech zones because they clearly see this as suppressing speech.
and it's only reserved for generally people who have views that are not aligned with the progressive orthodoxy on campus. Like if you were going to have a white privilege session learning about it, you're not going to be putting the free speech zone. You're going to have one of the main buildings on campus to have that session. But if you're wanting to demonstrate for gun rights, you're going to be put over in the free speech zone.
Yeah, I mean, that's just so interesting. Where's the ACLU on that, on protecting First Amendment rights of those who are put in that free speech zone? Of course, they're not going to be there. But if this were, again, the reverse, the ACLU would be all over that campus, and saying, oh, you're restricting the rights of others. So very interesting. You also talk about, conservative speeches. And I know that Milo gave the introduction, to your book and No Campus for White Men. Talk about, for those that didn't know what happened to him in Berkeley, talk about what that whole thing was about recently.
Well, Milo, for, a little over a year now, has been going around college campuses and giving a speech. And, he's a very provocative guy. His routine is less of that of a political commentator giving a speech, but more of a comedy routine, which is why a lot of young people come to it. It's very entertaining. He's very engaging. I mean, it's something that it's more fun. It resembles kind of like when college students see him. It's less of, this pristine, intellectual giving a speech, but more like a rock concert. Like people are jumping up and down and, people are laughing, and it's a lot of fun. But there's always been protests towards him. But recently, ever since Donald Trump was elected, there's been more violence directed towards Milo. Most of the protests, the worst that would happen is people would scream Nazi, and then they would, pour fake blood on themselves. But, nobody was getting attacked. But ever since Donald Trump was elected, there's been more violence and more people getting punched and harassed on college campus when he comes to speak. And this all came to a head at UC Berkeley. He was set to give his talk there, and he had already had issues going to UC campuses where there had been violence. There had been people punched, there had been people attacked. They had to have police presence there to ensure that things, stayed in line. And police were well aware that, there was a growing, anarchist pressure group to start doing really bad stuff there. So what happened is Milo was set to give his standard talk, and it was, probably going to be about, standard things about illegal immigration and other things that are protected by the First Amendment. But what happened is that there was not enough police there to handle the crowds, and they were kind of mute in their response. They stayed on the balconies while there was rioting going on, and these kind of anarchists came. Many of them not students, but some of them were students, as students themselves have been arguing. And they came, they disrupted the event, they removed the police barricades, and then they were using them to throw at the windows of the building where Milo was set to speak. Milo had to be rushed out under heavy security presence, canceled the show, but that didn't really stop the rioters as they set fires, began attacking anyone that they thought might have been attending the Milo speech. Like, for one of the people they attacked was actually a Syrian Muslim refugee, a Syrian Muslim, who was dressed up in a suit, and they said, "You look like a Nazi," and they pepper sprayed him and punched him in the face, and they, ran away. This is a guy who didn't even know Milo was speaking on campus. Wow. And then they began attacking everybody. There was $100,000 worth of property damage done, and this is all due to the fact that they wanted to cancel Milo from speaking on campus, and just because he has a conservative viewpoint. And this is all done, dozens of people attacked on camera. You could look on YouTube and see dozens of clips of people getting pepper sprayed or hit with poles and other objects. And this is all just because Milo was expressing a viewpoint that these leftists did not like.
Yeah, it was pretty ridiculous. I saw the videos, and I saw where it looked like the police had to honestly stand down orders that they weren't allowed to do anything. If they didn't, they certainly stood around and didn't protect anybody that I could see on the videos. You talk about, too, the Cal State University in Los Angeles when they had Ben Shapiro there, and we all know that Ben Shapiro is Jewish. And can you talk about what happened when he made his appearance there?
Well, it's very similar to how Milo, he went there, he had a heavy police presence, And once again, but this is more that campus leftists themselves did this. With the Milo incident, a lot of the people who were involved are these kind of black bloc, anti-fascists, Antifa for short, who kind of as their primary hobby like to go and attack people they think are Nazis or right-wingers, but most of them are not Nazis or right-wingers. They're just, crazy leftists. But with the Shapiro speech, it was primarily students who were involved who basically used the same kind of strong-arm violence. They, blocked doorways. They were, hurling objects at the building. They're shouting profanities at them. And basically, once again, Shapiro had to kind of cut his speech short and be escorted out under heavy police presence. And the school itself was more upset afterwards, after the speech was canceled, due to the aggressive actions of protesters who were assaulting people who were going to the Shapiro speech, who were blocking their way to get in. The school afterwards felt more upset that Shapiro was there in the first place than the fact that their students were causing a riot just by him appearing on campus, which is kind of ridiculous. Somebody's just going there to express their viewpoint that's protected by the First Amendment, and that many students there apparently wanted to hear, otherwise they wouldn't have had him. And they're just upset that somebody like that could have, stopped by on campus and share their beliefs, rather than the people who use violence and aggression to shut him down. That's what they had the simple limp-wristed, denunciation of the protesters, but nobody buys that for a second. They always have this we condemn violence, and then they kind of trying to celebrate themselves, but it doesn't come anywhere near the type of denunciation that they give to Milo and Ben Shapiro. Just an example, kind of going back to Milo, is that the mayor of Berkeley, the days leading up, was calling him a white nationalist, Nazi hater who is not fitting with Berkeley's community. And, this guy's response to the rioters is, this standard, mealy mouth thing about, we don't. But compare that with how he was denouncing Milo. He was much stronger in denouncing Milo than he was in the rioters.
Right. Well, and the thing in your book, too, No Campus for White Men, I remember reading that the professor there called Ben Shapiro a neo-KKK member. And like I said, Ben Shapiro is Jewish, and what an insulting thing. And it's become where people don't really care. Again, they don't really care what the truth is. It has to be something that they do to set their own agenda, and that's just a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's starting to develop is that pretty much anyone to the right of the New York Times editorial board is a Nazi now. They're calling everyone a Nazi. Ben Shapiro is the most ridiculous example. This is somebody who opposed Trump, for his own reasons. This is, as you mentioned, he's Jewish. I can't really say anything that he advocates is in line with National Socialism or the KKK or whatever. And they still label him this Nazi, which is just ridiculous on so many levels, but they label that for everybody as that way, and it's a way to dehumanize their opposition. I put this out in my book. The reason why they use this rhetoric is to make their argument better. That if every white person is a racist, then it's easier to attack them. If every conservative is not just somebody with a different point of view, but an evil Nazi, it makes more sense to shut them down, because we can't let Nazis speak at our campus. They use this rhetoric continuously, and it's now seeping into, standard mainstream politicians who are continually labeling Trump a Nazi and the next Hitler and all this crazy stuff. So, campuses aren't too far away from what's becoming standard political discourse in America.
Yeah, and I think that you made a really excellent point there. It's the dehumanizing part, because it gives those individuals, they feel they have a right to hurt someone. Physically hurt someone, because they've dehumanized them, and so they no longer look at them as just regular people. It's kind of like almost they're a thing that it's okay to do away with. I mean, and we're seeing that more and more with these groups and how they're treating people, because they don't really care that these are actual human beings. They don't look at them that way anymore, and that's really scary. And when that happens, I think we're going to, and it is happening, we're going to just see more and more of these violent acts. And I think that it's going to be up to the Trump administration. I mean, something's got to give. You got to stop this. You got to allow the police to do their jobs as the police, and get these people who have been accustomed to lawlessness for the past 8 years to get them under control, or it's going to get even more out of hand than what we've already seen. Now, you talk about in your book the American Creed and why that's unacceptable on college campuses. Can you talk a little bit about what it is and why it's not acceptable?
Well, as I say in No Campus for White Men, the reason why it's not acceptable is because these campus activists see America as built on white supremacy, that all these founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, everybody, is not somebody who is a great man worthy of adoration, but as somebody who is a bigot, who had these views that were not going to be welcome on a college campus. So the reason why they don't accept America as a creedal nation, which is the creed, the American creed, which is, everyone's equal under law. We believe in democracy, hard work, all the kind of American values. The reason why they don't accept that is because they see it was created by, in their view, white supremacists. And that's what it all comes down to, is they don't base these people on their words and their principles and their deeds. They just see them all on these basis of how they, these are the views of the founding fathers were no different from the rest of standard 18th century gentlemen. But they don't care about that issue. They just see them as evil, as slavers and all these things. And that's why they can't accept the principles they set forth in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. And you're seeing this more and more with, in regards to Thomas Jefferson himself. This is a man who arguably provided the intellectual basis for our country. And yet he's almost not welcome on college campuses anymore, even the one he founded. There's a recent example, a few months ago, where at the University of Virginia, there was professors and students banded together to tell their dean to stop quoting Thomas Jefferson, even though Thomas Jefferson founded University of Virginia and helped found the country that everybody lives in and everybody enjoys the benefits of. And there's also several other campuses where they have a Thomas Jefferson statue, such as at William & Mary and University of Missouri. They try to remove it. And this is profoundly anti-American, and to use their words, un-American, as we see all these protesters saying at the rallies against Trump. This is far more un-American. If you want to reject one of the main founding fathers just because of a set views that were standard for his day and age, then you're really just throwing out all of America, and especially our core principles and our core foundations. And that's why they refuse to accept the American Creed. Is not because of the kind of universal message laden in it, but because the idea that it was created by, in their view, white supremacists.
Well, and that would make some sense to why they don't obey the law, and they feel it's okay to riot and burn down buildings and things like that. I mean, if you don't believe in the law and the Constitution because it was based on white supremacy, then you're not going to follow the law or feel the need to follow the law. So, I mean, I think that kind of explains it. Doesn't excuse it, but it certainly gives an explanation of why people are doing that. I mean, I saw that in Inauguration Day when people were going crazy, and it's as though they didn't care. And I think making the laws tougher is going to hopefully stop that. And they need to, do that on college campuses. I mean, they really do. When people like Milo come to speak and the rioting starts, they need to arrest those people, charge them with felonies, and put them away for a while to show that, there is a law. We are all subject to that law, no matter what you think about the law. We're still subject to it, So, now let's talk a little bit about. I know Georgetown University, you mentioned in your book, No Campus for White Men, that they had proposed an atonement for slavery. Do you remember that part that you wrote?
Yeah, exactly. Yep, I definitely remember that.
Just explain that a little bit, if you will.
Well, the Georgetown the Jesuit or the priests who had been involved in Georgetown in the early 19th century, had sold slaves, and they used some of that profits to help build the university. What they were doing in 2016, the university, was basically saying we need to make amends for this, and they're going to create a new center. They were basically going to create affirmative action, even further affirmative action, for anyone who could demonstrate that they were the descendants of those slaves whose sale helped build the university. And when they did that, they also wanted to make all these other atonements. They did a public apology, and they were set there like, we're going to do a special center that is designed to research this and all these other matters. But when this is announced, a representative for the descendants of these slaves decided that wasn't enough. They wanted more. They wanted like a special scholarship grant that was in the millions to specifically set aside for these descendants to get into school. So it wasn't just a matter of them getting special privileges in terms of the admission process. It was also about that they needed scholarships as well too, which just goes to show that there's not enough good that you can do for a lot of these agitators when they make these demands, that they're just continually demand more. But that whole point of the fact that what happened at Georgetown shows this profound white guilt that dominates over these college administrators and many students, that they have to do these things because of what happened in the past. There's nothing that they can do to atone for the past. They all feel immensely guilty for these things, even though many of them have no relationship, like either by blood or ties or anything else, to these people of the past, but they feel profound guilt for it simply because they're white, and they must make atonement for it. And this is kind of, and the Georgetown example just shows it, because even what they proposed to help make amends for this thing that happened, nearly 200 years ago, it wasn't good enough for the people who were the supposed beneficiaries of it, and they demanded more, which kind of shows this vicious cycle that happens when they try to make these amends for these supposed past crimes, and then it just keeps getting worse and worse in terms of the demands.
Now, you also talk about an Emory University professor, George Yancey, and a letter that he wrote to America on Christmas Eve in 2015. Can you talk about that ridiculous letter?
Yeah, his letter to white America is basically, you're all racist, and that you must do more to acknowledge your whiteness and to support and to eliminate your whiteness. It kind of sounds ridiculous, but this is kind of the rhetoric that is becoming more and more mainstream, that just by having a color of your skin, you're racist no matter what. It doesn't matter your background and beliefs or how much you do to escape it. And that's the message of Yancey, is like, no matter what you do, you are benefiting from your whiteness, and that is unfair, and that is unjust, and that is an atrocity that you must correct and go to war against your whiteness. And he's not an outlier. I mean, and this is very much promoted by the university. He is a professor who looks into critical whiteness studies, whatever that means. And that's the kind of efforts that the university supports, with the taxpayer dollars, with the funds that come from parents sending their kids off to school, with student loans. This is the type of efforts they support, that basically we're going to fund these professors who are going to, with the flimsiest of evidence and the flimsiest of reasoning, use to justify calling all white people racist, just because of this hidden concept of white privilege or systemic racism and all that.
You also talk about a person named, last name is Coates, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Talk about his view about the people who died in 9/11.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, he's just won a ton of book awards for his book. I don't know necessarily if he's won the Nobel Peace Prize yet. I mean, he might someday, but he's arguably America's most preeminent intellectual. His last book, Between the World and Me, was a mega bestseller. It was enough for him to buy a $1 million house in New York. So it was definitely a big seller. But basically the point of the matter is showing that, kind of similar with Yancey, that all white America is guilty of racism and minorities have to struggle with it. And they're routinely brutalized. Their black and brown bodies are routinely brutalized on a daily basis. Now, this idea came to how he saw 9/11. When he was watching the towers, as like most Americans, they were horrified, felt immense sorrow at what was happening. But for him, especially when he was seeing firefighters and policemen wandering, he was not seeing, his fellow countrymen being burned alive and, dying in kind of the worst agony possible. What was happening, he saw agents of oppression, particularly, police officers and firefighters against people of color dying. And he felt kind of a bit of indifference to what was happening. He felt apathy to what was happening. He didn't see these as people who were his fellow countrymen. He saw these as evil villains who were marching into the World Trade Center and dying on behalf of trying to save people. And he just saw that because he sees policemen and firefighters as agents of oppression against the black community.
Yeah. Disgusting viewpoint, I might say. Now, you also talk about Peggy McIntosh. Talk about who she is and what she says.
Well, she's one of the primary. She's kind of a professional academic. But her primary purpose is that she's the chief promoter of white privilege. She wrote a famous essay in the 1980s about the invisible knapsack. That's how she compared white privilege to that. All whites carry this invisible knapsack around with us that gives us extra advantage in life, supposedly. And some of the advantages that gives us is that when we go into a record store, we don't have to be worried about getting harassed by employees or second looks. And a lot of these things are very minor things that you can't deal with by government or by any type of legislation. They just happen in life. And sometimes it's very minor things that in some ways that you can't go into a record store, which I don't even know. It kind of dates the essay because there's not very many record stores anymore. That these kind of minor day injustices that you have to worry about are somehow amount to an unbearable injustice against African Americans and other minorities. But the way she taught this to white people is that we carry this invisible knapsack around that gives us extra advantages. And that's how she kind of promoted white privilege, which has now gone from a fringe theory to a very mainstream theory. This is somebody who speaks at, colleges all across the camp, all across the country to deliver her message about white privilege. So it's something that's taken a lot different from the 1980s.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Peggy McIntosh is that, number one, she's white herself, or, her skin color is white. She also is a feminist. And her whole theory basically started out against white males. That was the original theory, that white males have a privilege that other people don't have. And then as time went on, she expanded her theory to include all white people and took it out of the realm of feminism. But I think it's important to know, where she comes from. And it's kind of, in my mind, she's sort of grown her theory so to grow in popularity, so it never goes out of style, And it's to me, it's a ridiculous theory, with a knapsack, like you said, carrying it around. We have this privilege, but the roots of Peggy McIntosh are in feminism, and it was all against white males to begin with.
Mm-hmm. That's how, and she specifically called it white male privilege. I mean, most of the invisible knapsack is actually about male privilege, but the parts that are become most famous is when she's talking about white male privilege.
Yeah. Okay, now you also talk about in your book, No Campus for White Men, California Pomona College, and they talk about there are 3 steps to making a good white ally. Can you talk about that?
Well, basically, all the steps about being a white ally is shutting up and listening to minorities and checking your privilege. It's all about kind of assuming a submissive role and a role that you're seen as inferior, that because of your color of your skin, you have to atone for so much of this guilt and sin of the past that you have to take a submissive role to be a good white ally. And that's the whole steps in that. It's all about sitting down, shutting up and not having to, and not, voicing your opinion, that you have to listen to what they're saying. And but that's kind of the role that they're wanting to assign to everybody. I mean, that's kind of a lot of the arguments for reparations, is that now we're seeing a lot of these, not just on campuses, but in just general life and in general, is that there are some black activists who are kind of starting these accounts where white people can make donations, and the reason for it is reparations. And there's many white liberals who fall for this, but it's all about making the whole point of being a good white ally is basically being submissive and shutting up and assuming that people of color are going to be the leaders, and that your role is to simply just stay there, stay put, and to never utter your opinion.
Yeah, for people who say, we want to talk, we want you to listen, and we want you to learn, and we want, to change things. You can't listen and learn things if you're not willing to also hear the other side speak. So that argument is like you said, it's not about listening and learning and having a dialogue. It's about shutting up. It's shutting up white people so that the people who are in whatever group that is, like Black Lives Matter, can say that, you have to listen to what we're saying and you just have to be quiet. And as you say, too, like with Black Lives Matter, all of these people, including George Soros' group and other left-leaning groups, have given so much money to them. And I don't know in that regard if it's about white guilt and all that. That's more of, again, an agenda to kind of create chaos. I mean, do you see that as being a little different than what's happening on college campuses?
Within regards of how they're sowing chaos?
Well, with Black Lives Matter and the people that give to them that fund Black Lives Matter, especially like George Soros, I don't think he's doing that as a part of being white guilt. I think it's more an agenda that he's trying to push to create chaos and to stay in control.
Well, with some people, I mean, George Soros is kind of his own kind of league in terms of this regards, because he's been doing this for years and years. Giving to these radical left-wing causes to further his own power and his own agenda. But I think when it comes to the, rank and file white liberals who support these causes, who give money to it, it is primarily based on white guilt. And that's kind of like what these activists rely on. It is about saying that, like, look, you have all these past sins that you must atone for. And the only way you can do this is by giving money to Black Lives Matter, is about supporting us, is about being a white ally, which is a good white ally, which means you just shut up and you just stand there with a sign and don't do anything else. But I think when it comes with Soros is kind of different from that, because he's much more, he has his kind of own interest and agenda, and it's not necessarily based on, I don't think he feels any white guilt in regards to this, because he has his own kind of agenda where he kind of wants to create a world without borders. And he funds these various left-wing groups in the hopes of someday achieving that.
Now, you also in your book, you talked about fraternities and sororities being under attack these days. And can you talk about that?
Yeah, fraternities and sororities are under attack specifically because of how what they represent on college campus. I mean, it's not all fraternities and sororities, because there's historically black fraternities that are pretty much all African-American, and other they call them multicultural fraternities that cater to ethnic minorities and other groups. And those aren't under attack. What's primarily under attack is the predominantly white fraternities and sororities. And the reason why is, one, is because they're predominantly white. Two is they also represent kind of a conservative alternative. I mean, conservative might not be the best term, but kind of a traditionalist alternative to the rest of the campus. I mean, yes, there's a lot of boozing and debauchery associated with Greek life, but it also represents traditional gender roles being assigned. Women are dressed up as very feminine. The way they present themselves is in line with traditional norms of what is femininity, and the same with men. These are guys who like working out, drinking beer, really expressing kind of this masculine ideal that is, to the rest of the campus leftists, is toxic masculinity that we must get rid of. And there's also a lot of support for the Republicans and conservative ideas among Greek life. So for these kind of, reasons that, these three reasons that it's predominantly white, it presents an alternative to the campus left, and is also, is typically associated with conservative politics. That's the three reasons why fraternities and sororities are under attack from the campus left, and why when there's a sexual assault that happens on campus that may or may not be true, they want to ban all fraternities, or if there's something else happening that they want to ban fraternities. And they want these organizations to also eliminate freedom of association, where they pick who can join their groups, who will be a member of their, groups. They want universities to almost kind of impose more diversity on these groups, that they have to have the same racial quotas that kind of go into a lot of the admissions process. Even though they're kind of independent groups that are based on freedom of association, where you get to pick and choose who you hang out with, they want them to change that and be instead more inclined to use, racial quotas and kind of all that type of stuff, just to make them more diverse and to change their character from these kind of conservative, traditionally masculine groups into something else that is more fitting with the campus left.
What do you think we have to do to change what's going on college campuses today, or can we change it?
It has to come. I think what the primary thing is, I outlined this in No Campus for White Men, a couple of ideas, but I think what more and more, and especially with the election of Trump, I'm beginning more and more to think that what's the most capable way of changing colleges is it has to come from the politicians we elect, both at the state and federal level. I think there has to be a pushback from a group that is more powerful than the administrators, and it can intimidate these administrators more than campus leftists. And I can't think of no other group than the people we elect to serve us in office. And what it has to come down to is it's like what Donald Trump did after the Berkeley riots and him threatening to possibly defund the UC system. You have to kind of make these threats and pressure these universities to start respecting free speech, to stop teaching this ridiculous nonsense about white privilege and to making people feel bad just because of the color of their skin. You have to push back against this, and this has to come from a group that is more powerful than these universities and has control over them, which these politicians do because they control the money that flows into these universities and can call these university administrators before a committee and, grill them on why these practices keep occurring on their campus. So I think the best way to do this is through our elected officials. I mean, there's other ways too, where parents and students can vote with their feet. Schools that are notorious hotbeds for campus leftism, they don't go there. They instead go to a school that has a, reputation for respecting free speech, that doesn't tolerate rioters, that doesn't tolerate intimidating people just because of their political viewpoints. So there's a couple ways you can do this. And I think also, conservative students have to get just as organized and just as aggressive in promoting their own cause as the left does on campus. So there's a couple different solutions, but I think the one that is most likely to succeed, or at least have no effect, is our elected officials addressing this problem and using what powers that are given to them to correct it.
Yeah, and it's very difficult for the conservative students because they're not typically violent and breaking windows and throwing things. So it's going to be one of those things where they're probably going to be shouted down and shut down, unfortunately, on campuses, even though if they start getting more organized and getting more vocal. But I do agree with you. It is something that I think is going to happen, or we're not going to be changing anything. Now, Scott Greer, I know we are out of time. I can't believe how fast everything went. Tell people where they can get your book, No Campus for White Men.
No Campus for White Men is now available on Amazon, both in ebook and paperback, and that is the best way to get it. It's also available at my book publisher, W&D Books Superstore. It's superstore.wnd.com. And so both those places are wonderful areas to get the book. So whichever way it pleases, but it's available right now on Amazon. And
then where can we read your articles that you write?
I write primarily at the Daily Caller, so dailycaller.com, and you can also follow me on Twitter at Scott M. Greer.
Okay, that's perfect. I do hope people go out and get your book because, as I said, I read it. I think it has a lot of knowledge. We don't often hear a lot about what's going on college campuses. A lot of people don't have time to follow everything, but it's so important that we do because, these people are our future, whether we want to look at it that way, scary as it may be at times. They really are our future, and I think parents can have a lot to do with stopping this if they're not liberal already. already themselves, and trying not to get people to, don't send your kids to these liberal colleges, or when things start happening at these liberal colleges, go and talk to the administration and try to get some of these things stopped. And I think it's going to get tougher and tougher as we go on, unfortunately, but I think that it's something that parents are going to have to do. So again, Scott Greer, thank you so much for joining us today. No campus for white men. Everybody go out and get that. And thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. And so glad everyone was here today. Thank you so much for joining us. And I do hope you go out and get Scott's book. It is an excellent book. Tell your friends about it. Until next time, take care of yourself, and we'll see you again next week.